Good morning. I'm Skip Reimer, the Executive Director of Programs and Communications for the Milken Institute. And on behalf of all of us at the Institute, welcome to the 16th Annual Global Conference. As you have undoubtedly seen, we've put together quite a program for you. A record 620 speakers this year on 140 sessions, focused on some of our biggest challenges from energy, medical research, education, finance, and much more. And we are here this week to try and find solutions to these challenges. Now, it's a packed conference from start to finish from our all-star panel we have here this morning, focused on the global economy and markets, all the way through Wednesday afternoon. Our final session was Rwanda President Paul Kagame, philanthropist Bill Gates, and former Prime Minister Tony Blair among them. Now, we've added a couple new twists this year you may see in your program for those of you who have been here before. We've added 3 afternoon plenary sessions for today, tomorrow, and Wednesday. We've also added a Tuesday evening wine tasting for those of you who enjoy wine. That's Tuesday evening. All the information for these are in your Global Conference app, on our website, or in the printed program you received. And you might want to take a look at those. We may have added some panels or some speakers since you last looked at that. Now, we are at capacity again this year, so there may be times when you are unable to get into the session you wanted to. Our apologies in advance for that, but you are free to go to any session where there is room. Another reminder that tickets are required for lunch. If you did not get a ticket in your registration packet, please go to the lunch concierge located at the Global Conference registration. One other note, you may notice that we have significantly ratcheted up our social media this year. You'll see Twitter on signs throughout the conference, and you are more than welcome to join these discussions. We hope you do. We're delighted you're here. We look forward to meeting as many of you as possible over these next 3 days. Most important, have a wonderful time. And now I'd like to introduce the moderator of our opening round, our good friend from UBS, Alex Friedman. Alex?
Thank you. Good morning, everybody, and thanks for being here. It's early in the morning, so we're going to try and keep this moving pretty quick. I'm going to start by just quickly introducing our panel, who I think everybody probably knows, but starting over to my left, we've got Ken, who's the founder and CEO of Citadel. We've got Mohamed, who's the co-CIO and CEO of PIMCO. We've got Terry Duffy, who's the president of CME. We've got Madelyn, Antoncic, who's the treasurer of the World Bank, and Willem, Buiter, who's the chief economist of Citi. So as you can imagine, these are very shy people, and they will have a hard time expressing their opinion. Since it is early in the morning, I thought I would start with an image that hopefully will keep people from falling asleep. When I look at the markets today in the position of trying to steer a pool of capital, it looks a bit like those old monster movies from Japan where Godzilla would rampage through the streets and their tail would destroy buildings and people would be scurrying for safety. And I don't know if you remember one of those movies, there was actually Godzilla versus King Kong. King Kong came in, he was beating his chest and he was fighting off Godzilla. Depending where you sit in the world, Godzilla in the Western world or the developed economies may look a bit like post-2008, the forces of deleveraging, austerity, deflation. And we've called in King Kong, largely in the form of central bankers, to come in and do what is necessary, do whatever they can to stimulate growth. If you shift to the developing world, the monster movie may play out differently. But regardless of which monsters we employ, there's always carnage in a monster movie. And there's always all these unintended consequences. And the only thing I can guarantee is every monster movie causes huge destruction. So I want to start in the United States, then shift to Europe, look at Japan and China. I want to try and get at this dynamic between, if you want to use more of an economist term, let's say, kind of the visible hand or the invisible hand of free markets, the visible hand of governments coming in, either on the monetary side or on the fiscal side, to try and fight off what they see as the enemy. It's going to be carnage. Let's start in the United States. Start with you, Mohamed. Who's going to get crushed?
Okay, first let me say good morning and say how wonderful it is to be back here. The good news is that so far King Kong is winning. The hope, to use your analogy, is that the visible hand of the Fed will hand off to the invisible hand of the markets and the private sector. That's the hope. And the question is when and how. So right now, we have to start with the understanding that we live in a world where growth is assisted by the Fed and where markets are very assisted by the Fed. So you have growth assisted and markets very assisted. Think of it this way, valuations are up here, fundamentals are down here, and the hope is that the fundamentals validate the valuations. Now, who gets hurt depends on how you see the journey and the destination. In the journey, when you have a non-commercial player in markets, there are collateral damages and unintended consequences. There are benefits, but let's not forget the collateral damage and the unintended consequences. And that's why Chairman Bernanke, all the way back in 2010, always spoke in terms of the benefits, costs, and risks of unconventional policies. So right now, we are seeing distortions in markets. The price signal mechanism is not working. Resources are being misallocated. And already there are concerns about bubbles. That is what gets broken on this journey. In the destination, all that doesn't matter if and only if genuine growth comes back. And that is what the markets are betting on, that is what the policymakers are betting on, that there is a return of genuine growth because the economy continues to heal. It's a 50-50 proposition. And I think that one of the hardest things, and that's why the excitement in the marketplace is accompanied by anxiety, one of the hardest things in life is to position for a 50-50 outlook. Right? And that's what we're all trying to do, and that's why you get this underlying anxiety right now.
Ken, how do you follow up on that? Do you give as much faith to the policymakers in the United States, maybe as Mohamed implies?
Well, I think there's two groups of policymakers. There's the Federal Reserve, and there's our elected officials in the House, the Senate, and the White House. And I believe that the Federal Reserve is really trying to counteract a number of the very poor policies that are coming from our legislative and executive branches. Mm-hmm. And it's damn near impossible to overcome the headwinds created by Obamacare, an inability to reform tax policy, an inability to thoughtfully create jobs in our country. And the Fed's policies are doing two things that I'm very gravely concerned about. Number one is we've all learned over the years that if you reduce the cost of capital, you increase your use of fixed assets and you take out jobs. Corporate America, seeing an ever-increasing cost for its employee base and extraordinarily low interest rates, is taking every step it can possibly take to reduce employment, to build factories abroad, and domestically to substitute technology and automated processes for people. So one of the very sad negative characteristics of the Fed's policies is it's leading to job destruction. The second issue with the Fed's policies are we are taking one of the greatest institutions in our society and eroding its independence from our political body. I find it hard to believe that as the Fed's balance sheet eclipses $3 trillion in assets, that future appointments will not be made upon the merits of somebody's academic, economic, and personal life experiences, but on the simple question, are you willing to continue to monetize our country's debt and to help our politicians hide their mistakes from the open market?
I want to jump around on that. Oh, Madelyn.
Can I jump in? I think in fairness to the Fed, and not that I'm defending the Fed, but I think in fairness, their view is that politicians haven't been doing enough and the right things to do, and so therefore somebody has to handle the situation. But I think we're focusing on the Fed. If you look at the other central banks, it's not just the Fed that's been doing this, right? The ECB, the UK, Bank of Japan, of course. And if you look at the amount of assets on the balance sheets of the Fed relative to GDP, it's actually the lowest. It's around 18%, whereas in Japan, and it's been for quite a long time, even before the crisis, around 30% of GDP. The assets of the UK is around 25%, and Euro is around 18. So it's not just the Fed. But I agree that it's an issue about having too much of central banks. The problem is that we don't have fiscal policy that's really making any sense in terms of fixing up some of the structural problems that we have, and that's really, the Fed is trying to do the fiscal side's job, and of course, that's not a sustainable thing. But my concern is not so much about the asset bubbles. I mean, we've seen asset prices rise. Clearly, real estate also is probably an issue. My concern is more the unintended consequences on the real economy. I think we're back to a point now which worries me about complacency. Take a look at how much leverage is back into the system. Take a look at covenant-light loans that are back to the highs that we had in 2007. One of the points that you had raised, among our conversations is about how high-yield debt, the yields are so low. But the yields are low, but if you look at the yields relative to leverage, they're even more lower. High yield relative to leverage is around 1.6 versus 3.5, which is the typical ratio for the last 2 cycles, which is really sort of like a PE, which shows that we're way overvalued in terms of the high yield space. And then, of course, the biggest concern that I have is pension plans, which no one's really talking about. If you look around 10 years ago, pension plans in the U.S. were pretty much funded. Today, they're 70% funded, and in my view, that's on a good day, because they're really using the AA corporate to figure out what that funding level is. Many of these pensions promise a real return, so if you look at the funding ratio of pensions on using TIPS as a discount rate, I would suspect the funding rate is even lower than that. So I think there's huge unintended consequences that's really in the real economy.
Terry?
Well, I have a couple different viewpoints on this. I started trading when I was 21 years old, and the one thing I always learned first was how do you get out of a trade before you put on a trade. And I don't think the central banks or the Fed has thought about how you're going to get out of a trade. I think Mohamed's got a very good point on how you're going to hand it off. That's in a perfect world. But after trading for 21 years and going into running the exchange, you have to always have a vision of how you're going to get out before you get in, and I think that's really been overlooked. That being said, you look at austerity that's coming up throughout Europe. Right now, they said that the suicide rate is up due to austerity. I heard that this morning. I thought, my God, holy Christ, suicide rate's up. So now the politicians, to Ken's point, is how are we going to get elected? We're going to have real good politicians. Well, politicians, what they do is they play with this stuff, right? So when we have the furloughs here for the airlines, right? So what they do is they deploy it in a way that makes the American public like a total disaster in a kangaroo court, even though their budget's gone up 6-folds and traffic's gone the other way. But yet they do it for political reasons, which I think is all the wrong reasons. So we need to get, in my opinion, the Fed out of the market more, get people back to making money off corporate earnings, get people away from worrying about government earnings, because we're trading all government earnings and not corporate earnings. And I think the best thing that I saw about that was on a Wednesday before they announced the $85 billion in cuts that they were going to have from the government, and I watched the Dow Jones tick an all-time high as we're facing what was going to be cuts in the marketplace. I think the market is finally starting to get past some of this stuff, and I think that's a good thing for the market. But in all honesty, I think the Fed needs to understand how they're going to get out before they get in. And if they're going to get in any deeper, they better start thinking how they're going to get out, because they're going to have to get out.
Willem?
Right. First, a footnote on central bank independence. Well, that's a bit of a myth, right? Central banks are only independent as long as they choose to do independently what society wants them to do, and they're elected politicians, right? So substantive central bank independence almost never happens except in exceptional circumstances, as in the euro area. We have one central bank facing 17 fiscal authorities, so it can ignore all of them. But that's not the normal one-on-one situation where the fiscal side is always dominant. I think the Fed can exit and will exit if it needs to, but you have to think about what exit for the Fed means from this still on balance, probably just about helpful policy in the US and the emerging markets, and the advanced economies, although I think it is now damaging on balance for the emerging markets. The QE here in Japan, soon again in the divided kingdom, and then also ultimately the the European version. The Fed will exit from QE, additional expansions of the balance sheet, probably sometime in 2014. Right? It will exit from zero interest rate policy, probably sometime in 2015. Do they ever have to shrink the, what is it now, 3 trillion and counting balance sheet? No. Right? They could, if the market's conditions are favorable, but central banks can live with any size balance sheet comfortably and without creating an inflation risk. Long rates will rise regardless of whether the Fed tapers off and ultimately reverses the balance sheet expansion. Long rates will rise possibly before the end of QE and possibly before the beginning of policy rate increases. The reason central banks can live with any size balance sheet comfortably and without inflation, unless they want to have it, is that they can sterilize the monetary side by issuing non-monetary liabilities that are monetary liabilities. If they don't like what banks are doing with the excess reserves, if the banks get a mojo back, right, and pick the excess reserves that are currently parked at the Fed and start lending it out, we get inflation, obviously, multiple expansion of credit. But at that point, you can turn the excess reserves into required reserves by raising reserve requirements. That's one tool. And finally, you don't even have to do that. The Fed has now the ability, since 2008-9, of paying any interest rate it wants on excess reserves, therefore making banks hold them idly, voluntarily. So, yes, a 3 trillion plus elephant balance sheet is impressive. You know, if I manage one, my kids would like me more than they do now, but it is not something that is a threat to anybody. It can just sit there until the markets are willing to take the stuff without unnecessary pain.
Madelyn.
That's very interesting.
So let me react to this, because Willem, if I listen to you, I would sleep well at night. But I don't sleep well at night.
Right.
So a couple of things.
Listen to me more.
First, I could say so much. First, the Fed would exit under two conditions, and it's very important to understand which one you mean. Either they exit because they are successful, or they exit because they become ineffective. Very different implication as to why they exit. Secondly, this notion that we can live with any size balance sheet, it doesn't matter how big, we can live with any size balance sheet, ignores the political reactions.
Yeah.
When the political system says, hey, wait a minute, the Fed is acting like a fiscal agency. There are checks and balances on fiscal agencies. Also, don't underestimate the view by the private sector. I think the key issue is go back. Why is the Fed here? The Fed is not here because it wants to be. Mm-hmm. The Fed is here because it feels it has to be. And why? Because of what Ken said, is that the political system in the US, even more so in Europe, is finding it very difficult to respond to the new realities. What are the new realities? A recognition that we've overpromised society and that we've made lots of contracts, financial contracts that we can no longer meet. Second, a recognition that the world is changing very quickly and our growth dynamics and our employment drivers are no longer working as well. And it's very difficult for a political system to respond to that. So I think the fundamental issue is not whether the Fed can live or not live, is at what point does the political system respond and stop leading from the back and start leading forward. Critical for Europe. Europe is even closer to what we call the T-junction. You know, in England they have this notion that you're on a road and then it ends. You can no longer travel on the same road. You either got to go left or right, right? And it's the political system that's going to determine whether Europe goes left or right, and then later on in the United States, whether we go left and right in terms of handoff, high growth, or back to a situation that I think none of us want to be in.
Madelyn wanted to say one thing.
Yeah, I agree totally with what Mohamed just said. The Fed is there because they have to be there because no one else is picking up, with their respective responsibilities. And I have to say, we have to be really careful about how they exit, obviously. And I think one of the things that the Fed is really now thinking about is, well, they don't want to have a situation that we had in '94. If you all remember how they, in very quick order, they pulled out, and it created yet another problem in the market. So I think it has to be, timed properly, it has to be communicated properly, it has to be when bank balance sheets are really back in order, which they're not totally, certainly not in Europe, and it has to be when, the economy is on sound footing. But I think if you take a look, perhaps the Fed is sending a signal, I don't know, but if you take a look at the most recent stress test that they've asked the banks to perform, banks are now being asked to perform stress tests, I don't know if you saw this, based on what would be one of the scenarios now, the first time that they've done this, is an increase in rates due to the Fed's pulling back and tightening. So maybe that's an early signal, maybe it's not, but maybe it's certainly the Fed's realizing that, yeah, this is a big, huge problem, we have to figure out how do we exit. But I could add one thing without obviously telling the content of the conversation. This past week I hosted a 2-day forum, the executive forum, right after our spring meetings with the IMF and World Bank. And I had 90 participants, 70 central banks from around the world, including the Fed, Bank of Japan, UK, Europe, and so on. And one of the biggest issues, of course, among this group is, how do we get out of this? And it's not as if they don't recognize, not as if they're not working on it. One of the big issues, of course, is the P&L impact, because keep in mind, they're all long these assets, but they also have other pools of assets, and their earnings go to their respective treasuries. And so, of course, the smaller their earnings are, the higher taxes have to be to supplement that. So it's on everybody's mind without a doubt.
I want to go to Willem.
Just a point that central banks are fiscal agents. The only choice they have is whether they want to be transparent and accountable or non-transparent and non-accountable, right? The Fed, at the moment, is actually quite transparent because all it puts on its balance sheet on the asset side, at the moment, is treasuries, and treasuries by another name, agency MBS, right? All the agency debt is basically treasury debt now. They're part of the general government. So that's perfectly transparent. There's no issues there. The only political economy issue, and I think that is important about the size, is if some congressman from somewhere looks at the Fed and says, my God, they got MBS on there. Well, I have a constituent who runs a ball bearings factory, and he can't sell his debt either, right? Why don't you, Mr. Bernanke, go and buy that debt? And then you get a perversion of the allocation of credit. And that is a risk the larger the balance sheet is. I can see that. But for the rest, there really is no problem. Regardless of whether the Fed is successful, I think they'll be moderately successful. We're not going to get the growth back that we used to have in the US, because the growth rate of potential output, once we take up the slack, is 2.5% at best, rather than the 3.5% that people were dreaming of in the bad old days. So, it will be a modest recovery, but that has nothing to do with whether they can sit on their balance sheet or not.
Let's shift to Europe for a second. Since Draghi put the OMT program in place, there's been a quieting. All right, we'll start with Mohamed on that, and then we'll go to a different question. Mohamed, since Draghi put the OMT program in place, it seems like people have stopped worrying. Peripheral bond spreads have come down a bit. It looks to me like a Band-Aid. People are fleeing France. They're giving up their citizenship in Spain. At the same time, German bond yields are pricing in either 10 years of Japan or a breakup of the Eurozone, something like that. Where do you see it going?
So it's incredible contrast. Today, again, Italian spreads are doing very well. You look at the financial markets, it seems that things have settled down in Europe. And then look at the data out last week. Unemployment in Spain, 27.2%. Youth unemployment in Spain, 57%. And the weakness is now contaminating the core. So you have financial stability, or the sense of financial stability, and continued economic implosion. The market looks at that and says, yeah, I'm willing to bet on the financial stability because I've got a central bank that is committed to doing, quote, whatever it takes, and, quote, believe me, it will work. The problem, again, go back to the T-junction, this road that we're on, which is a central bank assisted road, has got to give way to one of two things. The hope is it gives way to a more coherent Eurozone. And a more coherent Eurozone is one of two choices, and that's all it is, one of two choices. Either the strong countries agree to subsidize the struggling economies in a much more aggressive manner, the so-called Eurobonds, no different than what West Germany did for East Germany just over 20 years ago. You make a political decision, and you decide to live with the economic consequences, and you don't second guess yourself every day. Or Europe opts for what's economically sensible, but politically difficult, is a smaller Eurozone. That is the road to bringing back a hope of growth. The other is that the political system does not respond. The ECB is not able to maintain things because people start losing confidence in the system, and then you get renewed financial instability. And if you want a perfect illustration of what's going on, let me use the one example that too many people are willing to dismiss as small, unique, exceptional: Cyprus. Yes, Cyprus is only 1 million people. Yes, Cyprus is only 0.2% of GDP for Europe. But Cyprus told you a few things that we should all take seriously. One, the fire brigade, the first responders in Europe, known as the Troika, the IMF, the European Central Bank, and the European Commission, are no longer coordinated well. Why? Because now they know that their own balance sheet is threatened. So in the old days, they would hold hand and go in together. Now it's, oh, you go first, no, you go first. So you get very strange outcomes, as we saw in Cyprus. Second, there's creditor fatigues. The creditors are no longer willing to simply sign checks. Third, there's debtor fatigue. They're not convinced that this austerity, as it's called, that this austerity is going to lead to a good thing. And therefore, you have a fundamental problem, and the fundamental problem is that the growth model is broken. Not growth, the growth model. Cyprus will not grow going forward. Why? Because it bet on an offshore banking system, and when you penalize 60% of someone's deposit, you are no longer an offshore banking system. You need to find a new growth model. So Europe is heading towards this politically charged decision point within the next 12 to 24 months, where either politicians step up and make a historic decision, or the weak economics start destabilizing the financial process again.
Ken, from an investment perspective, how do you kind of look at the consequences of dislocations in terms of state intervention, driving down, say, the yields on the fixed income market, and or divorcing the fundamental values of certain asset classes? Where do you find opportunities in this kind of dynamic?
The most negative impact of the magnitude of government intervention is it reduces participation by market professionals. It is extraordinarily difficult to forecast corporate earnings. It is damn near impossible to forecast what a central bank is going to do in this politically charged environment with their back against the wall. As Mohamed pointed out, in Cyprus, we saw a great deal of chaos and confusion heading into the Cyprus agreement. It's very difficult for market professionals to position and to take risk in front of that. Net, what does that do? That raises the cost of capital for the system as a whole, which obviously reduces jobs growth and reduces capital formation.
Terry, from the perspective of navigating both markets and running a company, what are the kind of impacts of this changing set of regulations from where you sit?
Well, I think it impacts everybody because, first of all, we could talk about interest rates. Interest rates affects everyone's business. So we look at that price of the product. And then we go into regulation and we look at what's going on in the United States versus what's going on with MiFID and EMIR and other regulations throughout the world. And what I am concerned about is we are getting into more and more of a regulatory arbitrage against U.S. companies. And when you do that, you put the U.S. at a complete disadvantage to the one particular item that we have a distinct advantage over the rest of the world on, and that's financial services. I don't ever want to become an importer of the financial services product, and I think if we continue to go down this path and we try to layer regulation on top of regulation because we're going to make sure that nobody ever can cross the street without getting hit by a car, we will eventually regulate ourselves out of business. I think we need to come up with sane rules. I think we need to, I always said back in 07 and 08 when I was testifying, just come up with a little adult supervision. Let's start to have better lending practices. Let's lend money to people that will actually pay us back, not to people with a pulse. I think that's a bad sense for business. And that's what we got away from because we're all selling our debt to Fannie and Freddie and off we go and we're having a great day till it implodes. It's no different than the central bankers in and out of the market. I think that What we also need to do is give certainty to the participants of a marketplace. The worst thing that we could have in this country is uncertainty when it comes to regulation. Because when you have uncertainty, you have people backing away from markets because they don't know what they're going to do if they're potentially violating a rule. When they do that, they have less liquidity. When you have less liquidity, the cost of business goes up from the farmer, the banker, the people producing refineries, and everything else. You look at the EPA. Let me just jump all over the place for a second. Why not? Look at the EPA. I talked to some people in the gasoline refining business. They cannot put up another refinery on the East Coast because of the EPA. Why? Because the standards are so high. You can't build a manufacturing plant in the United States. Why? Because the air has got to be cleaner inside the plant than outside the plant. There are a lot of problems in this country. If we just have some normalcy, and I think people overseeing some of these agencies, we can, again, be very competitive and the leader around the world. So regulation, in my opinion, is very important.
Madelyn.
Yeah, I would. I agree with what Jerry just said, and I would go back to 08. And what concerns me is that from a political perspective, everybody wants to jump in and regulate just to look at it as if they're doing something. And the reality is, I don't think that we did not have enough regulation. I don't think that we had incorrect regulation, even in 08. Some things, of course, needed improvement, but I think the bigger issue that we had is we had inconsistent regulation and inconsistently enforced. So you could be a bank, an investment bank, an insurance company, a hedge fund, all doing the exact same thing, yet we were regulated differently depending on how we were incorporated or chartered. So for example, ACA, which is a perfect example of an insurance company that started as a monoline wrapper, morphed into doing all the CDO wrapping, and they were the enabler for that whole sector, yet there was inconsistent regulation because they were on a statutory accounting basis as opposed to a GAAP basis.
I got to stop you on this and ask you a question, which is inconsistent regulation. It seems to me it's something we can say in retrospect or sitting from where we sit, but you kind of bridge these two worlds in the sense that I think you have a private sector background, but you're in at the World Bank now. The fog of war, by definition of that cliche, the fog of war, it implies that there will be inconsistency in reaction to some crisis because you don't know what's going on. So I don't know how we can expect that policymakers will but have inconsistent reactions. What worries me is what Mohamed said, which is during a crisis where there's enough time, you kind of see some consistency start to evolve in terms of how the Eurozone approached, say, the last year, this binary dynamic. Now they're starting to splinter in self-interest. I guess I would question your basic supposition that inconsistent regulation is a problem. I think it's the norm.
No, I'm saying even just look in the U.S. I'm not even talking U.S. versus Europe. What I'm saying is a bank and an investment bank. Just take simple thing, mark-to-market and no mark-to-market, right? That created an arbitrage, and that created people reaching for business, which created a lot of what we saw. Take the example that I was starting to give with ACA. This was an insurance monoline wrapper, which wrapped municipals, and they were regulated by the insurance company, but they morphed into being nothing but an investment bank where they were wrapping CDOs, which was the enabler to do more and more. And in fact, at one point, they had a negative net worth of $1 billion, yet they were still single A rated because of the way it was regulated. And so if we just fix that alone, we could go a long way.
Willem, did you want to comment?
Well, this was on Mohamed's point about Europe's choices. Can I come back to that for 1 second? Because regulation is fun, but it's always revisiting the last disaster and preventing it without learning the general lessons that whatever you try to regulate moves either abroad or in unregulated corners of your own economy. And if you put some lack of coordination among major players, regulators, on top of that, you have a complete and utter mess which we're in now. But as regards Europe, I think the markets that price sovereign debt in Europe must be inhabited by glue sniffers because Europe will not move towards fiscal union and large-scale cross-border transfers in time to handle the current banking and sovereign crisis. I wish it were different. I'm a European federalist, but I also like Father Christmas. So we are, however, moving fast towards, I think, very important developments, the two key dimensions of banking union, which are the single supervisory mechanism and the single recovery, resolution, and recap mechanism. Deposit insurance is going to be, for death, widows, and orphans, not going to be a meaningful issue. But with these two dimensions, especially the single recovery and resolution mechanism and single supervisory mechanism, we will use the template of Cyprus to resolve banks throughout the euro area and recapitalize them or close them down, depending on whether it's systemically important or not. So this puts all unsecured senior creditors, except uninsured depositors, at risk in the euro area banks. Now, the second dimension, which the markets are not seeing at all, partly because the politicians deny that we're going to have further sovereign debt restructuring involving private creditors, is that we will see more sovereign debt restructuring by private creditors in the periphery. We may have a handful of countries that will restructure the sovereign debt. They're already doing it with the publicly held sovereign debt. Ireland twice now, Portugal when they extended the maturities. That's a net present value negative exercise, but I'm talking about the real stuff, where private creditors take a NPV haircut. And sovereign debt restructuring in the periphery is what we mean by saying there's too much austerity, because we either fund them out of our pockets, which is not going to happen on a significant scale, somewhat, yes, but not enough, or you bail in the creditors. So we will see, I think, a development gradually of the sovereign debt restructuring mechanism that the euro area should have had, and that was originally part of the design of the ESM. We at the moment only have a contractual type approach to sovereign debt restructuring through CACs and other ineffective instruments. But we will, I think, starting probably with one or two of the Hellenistic economies, have further private sector involvement in sovereign debt restructuring in Europe, spreading then to the periphery. The markets do not see this, they do not want to hear it. They believe that Mr. Draghi is there and has promised that it wouldn't be hurt. He didn't actually, but listen the next time.
We're going to stay in the Western Hemisphere just a little longer, and then I want to shift us to Asia. Ken, how do you navigate from an investment perspective Europe, or do you?
No, I think I was reasonably clear earlier, which is it's extraordinarily hard to navigate through a market which is politically driven in outcome.
So do you participate? What do you do?
We are very small participants in Southern Europe. Very small. And the issue in Europe, as others have alluded to, it's not just about the financial stability, it's about the will to conduct labor market reform. Mm-hmm. I think Germany has really lost the war of the words with their focus on austerity. Yes, Europe needs austerity, but what Europe desperately needs is labor market reform to allow companies in Spain, in Italy, to aggressively grow again. Every force within those countries shifts power to the unions as companies grow and takes away the ability for entrepreneurs to reap the rewards of their efforts. We need in Europe, if we're going to have a federalized Europe, is we need a labor market that looks much closer to the UK or Germany and much less like France, much less like Spain, much less like Italy.
Mohamed, one of the issues from where I sit is this growing divergence between Germany and France, which, as the architects and drivers of the common currency, had been more unified. What do you think the implications are going forward as France veers, and even though Germany is starting to suffer now too?
So it certainly is worrisome. If you look at the Eurozone, you need a strong core, and a strong core should, and I would argue must consist of more than just Germany and Netherlands and Finland. It has to have another large country, and France is traditionally playing that role. And then the second element of a Eurozone that is sustainable is that the other two big economies, Italy and Spain, stabilize. So your view on the Eurozone is really a view on, do these big four find a way of working together in a manner that promotes economic growth? And I'm going to come back to that issue, because without economic growth, we're going to be here next year talking about the same issue. How you navigate all this, since we're in Southern California, let me use a analogy, and Alex, you're not going to like this, I apologize, that Bill Gross came up with. And it explains a little bit what Willem was referring to. Investing fundamentally is like being a surfer in a surfing competition. You're waiting for the right wave. You cannot wait forever. In a surfing competition, if you wait forever, you never take a wave, the competition is finished, and you lose. So investing is about identifying the right wave, riding it as long as possible, safely, and then understanding how it's going to break and kicking out. And then you go and find another wave. The markets have discovered the big wave. It's called central bank liquidity. And the markets are riding this wave, and it's critical to understand that if you're on that wave, first, it's really crowded. There's lots of people on that wave, so accidents can happen. Secondly, it's an artificial wave, and at some point, it's going to have to give way to something else. And understanding that element, what it gives way to, and when do you kick out. Now, some people like Ken say, you know what, I'm going to be very cautious because this is such an artificial wave that I can't even predict its dynamics. Others are the other way around, what you refer to, Willem, saying this is a permanent wave. I don't have to worry, right? And we are somewhere in the middle.
Mohamed said I wouldn't like that because I asked him not to use any metaphors beforehand. But no offense, I'd probably be like saying to an Italian fellow, you can't use your hands when you're talking. So I love metaphors, but you're the master of them. I guess one question of this wave is, what do you each think is the worst unintended consequence? What's the worst unintended consequence of that wave? Because waves crash.
Well, it's asset market perversions. It's the complete depression of safe yields to negative levels in real terms and near zero levels in nominal terms, which even in the advanced economies now results in a reach for yield that causes people to do crazy things. High yield investments are what we used to call medium yield investments or low yield investments. So, investors with fixed targets are doing crazier and crazier things. So we have the beginnings of, we're not there yet, of another boom, bubble and bust, purely financial this time, without any support from the real economy, simply because all this infinite liquidity that is being injected, and in Japan, injected on a scale that makes Ben Bernanke look like Scrooge, right? They're doing 12% of GDP annually. The US is only doing 5.5%. No, that's better. So, and wait till the ECB starts expanding its balance sheet again. They've been shrinking it ever since the LTROs have been replaced, but they won't do that forever. So I think we're going to be drowning in liquidity, perverting the incentives here. And of course, in the emerging markets, we already see the asset booms and bubbles that are partly created in Frankfurt, in Tokyo, and in Washington. Countries leaning against the warranted appreciation of their currencies, unable to sterilize the reserve inflows, excessive credit growth, asset booms and bubbles. And this is the negatives of it. Would I stop it? Give me something else. Right? Reform in Europe would help. In fact, if the Europeans simply created what was supposed to be created decades ago, a single market, it would help. Right? We have a 25% European Union for manufactured goods and agricultural goods. 75% does not yet trade across borders, so that would be a big boost. And of course, radical labor market reform. We're fighting the intergenerational war in Europe on the backs of the children, on the backs of the, not just by lumbering with taxes, that's true everywhere, true here as well, right? Social security, Medicare, but in Europe, the good jobs are for papa and mama, and the rubbish jobs, unemployment or emigration, are for sonny and daughter. And that is not the way to run a society.
And I think that is the essence of the issue here, which is the central bank facilitated policies are allowing our politicians to delay making the difficult decisions. Mm-hmm. So yes, there could be a crash in bond yields that is inconsequential compared to the loss of human capital in Spain amongst the youth. Mm-hmm. If you're out of the labor market throughout most of your 20s, where are you going to be in your 40s? The loss of human capital that takes place in Spain, in Italy, and the United States each and every day dwarfs the economic upside of the central bank's policies around the world.
Can I add one other thing? I agree totally with what Ken said in terms of reforms, and I certainly agree with your sort of reaching for yield story. And I think we need labor reforms. I think we also need fiscal reforms, obviously, in Europe. But I think one other thing that's really important is if you think about the SMEs, certainly in Spain and in Italy, those are the ones that really are the engine for the growth in Europe. And I think one of the problems that Europe might have is that, look, there's no really well-developed capital markets. It's really from banks is where money, where companies get money. In the US, 70% of corporate money comes from capital markets, 30% comes from banks. In Europe, it's just the opposite. 30% comes from capital markets, 70% from banks. And when banks have a problem, which we've just seen, they shut down, and therefore the flow of money just shuts down. But if we had a reform in terms of building financial markets, capital markets in Europe, I think that would go a long way to helping the SMEs. In the short term, I think the way that we could help grow out of the problem in Europe is that the SMEs need money. They need capital. And of course, the banks have deleveraged because they have their own capital problems. One of the things that perhaps could help is if the ECB would at least accept the loans as collateral that they're making to SMEs as they're accepting other kind of collateral. And then the second thing is we have to reopen the securitization market for SMEs. So I think long term, we need capital markets. Short term, we need to reopen the securitization market. A lot of insurance companies were buying SME securities in a securitized private form, but that's shut down. So I think one of the other unintended consequences of the regulation is the way things shut down for those. They are the engine of growth in Europe.
Sure.
If I might just comment, you mentioned earlier, what are the unintended consequences? And I was just trying to sum up what I heard here today. And I really think from my standpoint, I am the father of 10-year-old twin boys. And I'm thinking the unintended consequences for me is that young people today are going to think this is a perfectly acceptable behavior to continue on with exactly what we've been doing over the last 50 years. And in my opinion, it's not. We got to have good elected leaders sometime in this world to fix some of these problems, or at least to try to address some of these problems. Everybody's turning a blind eye to what's going on around the world as we continue to mire ourselves down in more and more debt, and that happens around the world. So I think, I was flying here from yesterday from Chicago to here, and I looked out the window and I thought to myself, what a great country, right? But the problem with this country is, I looked at it and grew up as this country is a land of opportunity. The young people today are looking at it as a land of entitlement. And I think that's bad policy, bad precedent to set, and we better get to the young people today so we can have a future for tomorrow.
So I'm gonna take the other side of this. I think the young people realize more than anybody else, the young people realize that this system is not going to deliver to them as much as it has. And the question they face is, are they willing to take their own destiny in their hands in a positive sense? So we have two economies. We have the economies that we have been focusing on so far that are not responding to the challenges, that involve huge human costs, and I agree with you, huge human costs. People are going to go from being unemployed to unemployable, which is a lost generation. And it's very artificial because of what the Fed and others are having to do. But there's another economy, much smaller, that's incredibly dynamic, that is achieving massive productivity gains, either because there's technology behind it. Shale energy. You talk to our analysts there, they think the world is great. They cannot believe the opportunities ahead of them. Digitalization, enormous, enormous benefits. Then there are parts of the world who are not touched by central bank liquidity, and they have no choice but to get their act together. Look what's happening in Africa. Incredible what's happening in Africa today. Look at what's happening in certain parts of Asian society. So I think one of the things that we've got to recognize is we have this big traditional economy struggling. We have a smaller economy over here that is able to respond either because they have innovation or because they have no choice. And our challenge is to try and get this part to influence this part, as opposed to this part influencing this part, right?
I want to actually move to the non-Western hemisphere for a second, but before I do, I'd like to ask a very direct question to everybody here, and you can answer just by raising your hand. Who here thinks that in 3 years we'll see exits from the Eurozone? The Eurozone will not be intact the way it is today? Within 3 years, will countries have left the Eurozone in Europe?
And some will have entered as well, of course.
Sorry?
Some will have entered as well. Latvia is about to join.
Okay,
Yeah.
fair enough. The Eurozone looks structurally different than it does today.
Yeah.
1, 2, no.
I'm 5, 10 years. It's not making it 10, but 3. They've made it a long way so far. and they seem incredibly committed to this path. I think one of the biases that we have living in the Western world in the United States, we never went through the inflation they lived with in Italy for so long, or the struggles they faced in Spain for so long when their monetary policy was in their own hands. You know, I think it's very easy for Americans to say, well, geez, I love my independence so that I could have my own monetary and fiscal policy. I think the Italians are saying, well, wait a second, we did that for a long time and it was pretty damn horrible. So I think the will amongst the southern countries to tolerate some of the austerity imposed by the North and the humiliation imposed on them by the North is hard for us to really appreciate living here in the United States. But I do think, inevitably, the differences in productivity between the North and South and the differences in labor market practices between the North and South are going to eventually drive an end of the Eurozone as we see it today.
I want to just add to one thing that you said, and I agree totally. I think, and I have always been a naysayer, and I've never believed that you can have monetary policy separate from fiscal policy, which we're seeing now, but I think they will sort that out. Because something that we have underestimated as an American, and I think you hit it, is we've also not experienced what they've experienced in terms of the war. I mean, they still go back and talk about the war all the time, so they've got an amazing determination to make this work. And so while we look at it and we say, wow, this looks pretty sloppy, it kind of takes so long and things change and evolve. Think about it, they've got 27 different countries that they're trying to corral, 17 of whom is now in the sort of the euro. And it's just amazing that they got that far. So having always been a doubter, I think I am turning more and more to believing that, you know what, it's painful, that the process they're going through, but take a look at how long it took the U.S. to become, one country. And so that's how they're thinking about it. They are determined. They have an amazing will. The reality is no politician wants to be the one to be cited as he's the guy or she's the woman that, made the euro dissolve. And so there's an enormous political will, and certainly there's an enormous will within, the population. Every time they have these polls, while they have all kinds of rallies, when they vote, they want to stay in the euro. They want their cake and they want to eat it too. I think the most important thing is they have to get the banking union resolved, and there is plans towards going to, by the end of this year or next year, to have that in place. Yeah. So if they have one single supervisor, the ECB, then they have, sort of bank insurance among the countries. I think they're going to sort this out.
Maybe they will. I think a lot of it might depend on whether or not what Mohamed started with, which is this handoff from kind of central bank band-aids towards underlying growth, ever actually kicks in Europe. But I would like to move to Japan and ask Willem, we can't talk about central banks getting aggressive without looking at perhaps the most remarkable set of interventions we've seen in a while, much larger than what the Fed has done. You think Abenomics can work, and how do you look at it?
Oh yes, I'm sure it will work in the sense that it will eliminate deflation and that it will permit a cyclical recovery. It won't do anything to change the rubbish trend growth rate of Japan, right? That's determined by demographics, lack of immigration, very low birth rate, very low female participation rate, and then this dual economy, this world-class manufacturing, and rubbish services and bijou agriculture that makes Switzerland look like the United States, right? So, but it will give us inflation. Yes, if you do, especially what the Japanese are doing now, which is actually having a version of helicopter money. They're having a temporary fiscal expansion, which is permanently financed by increasing the monetary base. They're doubling the monetary base. They're adding 12.5% of 12% of GDP to the balance sheet. This balance sheet is going to be close to 60% of GDP. Even Bernanke can't put that on the mantelpiece. And you can always do that. I think they're likely, if they don't meet the objectives of 2% inflation or look unlikely to meet it, they'll simply up the ante. They can have another fiscal expansion, which I think they will have in 2014, when they are likely to postpone, in my view, the consumer tax increase. And so they will do that. They will do, of course, increase rates in the process, long rates, and imposing losses on holders of the stuff. But the only way that Japan is going to get out of its debt problem, public debt problem, is, of course, by having a wealth levy of some kind, right? Either through inflation, or through explicit taxes. And inflation is going to help them a bit.
What you just said, I want to ask Mohamed, which is, I'm told that the sale of adult diapers in Japan has now surpassed the sale of baby diapers, literally. You got a very old population with fixed income savings that they plan to finance their retirement. And what Willem just described is the destruction of their savings will decimate a whole generation of elderly. How do you see that?
So demographics, an aging population, the problem with how difficult it is to implement structural reform, and the willingness of the rest of the world to accommodate this incredible experiment are the key issues. So I love what Willem said, that this makes Ben Bernanke look like Scrooge, because if you believe that the Fed was involved in a policy experiment, which it is, this is a policy experiment turbocharged. It's 3 times as large as what the Fed is doing. It's much more ambitious in terms of its objective. It starts with worse initial conditions. And critically, it can only achieve its outcome if it takes market share away from somebody else. Very different from the US. So in order for the system to work, first of all, it's not enough that they have done monetary expansion. It's not enough that they've done fiscal. They've got to move very seriously on structural reforms. And so far, that has not happened. And part of it is the demographics. Part of it is just the difficulty, the political difficulty of doing that. So if you don't see structural reforms happening pretty quickly, this can only work by taking market share away from other countries. And already there's a sense of nervousness in Asia. There's a sense of nervousness in some other countries as to what are the implications.
Yeah, how do you think Korea looks at this?
Well, Korea is nervous because if you model 2% inflation, you're looking at a yen in the 115 to 120 range, right? And 115 to 120 is quite disruptive for the direct competitors, and you're talking about Korea, China, and the Eurozone.
Germany.
And Germany at the Eurozone. It's also quite disruptive for everybody who's going to get this liquidity that's being thrown at an economy that cannot absorb it. Brazil, Mexico, et cetera. So this is, I mean, the exciting thing for people like us is we get to live through a major experiment, right? And our kids and our grandkids will be talking about this, right? But this is, again, go back to the model of central banks, of pharmaceutical companies that feel compelled to bring medicine to the marketplace that has not been clinically tested. And when they don't see the response, is what Willem said, I'll give you another dose. You know what? I'll give you another dose, right? And that is what is happening right now, right? And we on the receiving end, on the marketplace in the beginning say, hey, this is great, we're getting medicine, this is great. But at some point, we're going to have to think about the unintended consequences.
Yeah.
Speaking of,
I don't think you actually sat around and said, this is great ever. I mean, my guess is that you never sat around and said, this is great, because the unintended consequences are so black and white. If the road to prosperity was paved by inflation, Germany would control the entire world today. All right? We have a particular edge condition, which is that in the credit markets, over the last 100 years, the general assumption between a borrower and a lender is there would be inflation. And you pick a rate of interest that would cover the rate of inflation, plus a risk premium for credit risk and a risk premium for liquidity provision. Deflationary economies were outside of the mental framework of borrowers and lenders.
Yeah.
Outside of the mental framework. And because of that, deflationary forces are incredibly destructive in today's economy because of the high amount of leverage inherent in our modern economies. So we clearly want to push inflation back to positive. But we certainly do not want to take the risk of pushing it to a point where people start to anchor to the idea that inflation will exist. And we get back to where we were when Volcker had to come into power.
Yeah.
Or, God forbid, we go someplace far worse. So I appreciate the central bank's focus on fighting deflation. It's a framework none of us ever counted on when we were borrowers and lenders in our overall economy. But if inflation paved the road to prosperity, there are countless countries before us that would be what would be viewed as the superpowers of today.
Zimbabwe.
This is why I use the Godzilla King Kong, because there's still a lot of damage, regardless of whoever wins. But Madelyn.
Is this thing working?
Yeah.
Okay. I just want to make two comments to that. I think it's inflationary expectations that really matter, not inflation per se, right? And so long as the expectations are in control, then I think that's not a problem. And I'm not advocating inflation, but if we look at inflation or deflation, just from the financial side, the assets, that's one thing. But I think we really need to look at the fundamental economic aspect of the reason that they want to have inflation. With deflation, with deflation, consumers aren't spending. And consumers aren't spending because they figure, well, it's going to be cheaper tomorrow, so I might as well work. And I think we need to think about the different cultures. In the US, if something is cheaper, everybody runs to buy it. But in Japan, if it's cheaper, people figure, well, I'm a saver to begin with, and I'll wait until tomorrow. Part of it's demographics. You have older population, and the older population aren't the ones that's spending money. It's the younger population. But there's also this culture in terms of, well, why not wait until it's cheaper tomorrow to buy? So the point is really, from a real economy perspective, let's boost spending. Let's try to get people to spend. If they think it's going to go up tomorrow, let's try to go and get that price, locked in today. And hopefully that'll trigger the economy to move and boost and kind of, get the engine growing. So that's really, so it's true what you're saying about when you look at it from the borrower and lender side, but if you look at it on the flip side and on the real economy, there is something to be said.
With American consumers showing their willingness to pay up to 18% interest rates on credit cards, a small amount of deflation, 1%, isn't going to make any American wait for tomorrow to buy something. It's just not going to happen. Americans want it now. We've demonstrated we pay almost any rate of interest to have it now. That's not the issue in the United States. The issue in the United States is that we have had a jobless recovery now since 2008. And we've had a jobless recovery with countless just wars between our two parties in Washington, unable to resolve simple matters of entitlement reform. And simple. We know what we need to do. We need to raise retirement ages. It's not that complicated.
While we're talking about this battle between free markets and state-directed markets and some of the implications, I think we can't ignore China, which is going through a seismic shift. Who wants to comment on kind of how you see China today? I'm not sure if this is on Willem or Mohamed or.
I'm happy to start on that. China is clearly in a very difficult transitional phase. The old growth model, if there ever was a dead old growth model, it's there. They can, it's one of the living dead. You can keep it going a few more years, but by increasing the misallocation of capital, by increasing the environmental destruction, which is really not the tree-hugging variety in China. It's not being able to breathe when you walk down the street in Beijing. So it's very serious issues. They have to change their growth model. And even then, right, the best they can hope for is that given the demographics and given the lower investment rate that they undoubtedly start implementing, they'll be growing the second half of this decade by, say, 6.5%. The question is, can they get there smoothly, or will they have to go through a recession? And that's the short-term problem. China has injected massive liquidity. I mean, they may not have QE, but if you look at what has happened to what they call total social credit, which is sort of banking credit and shadow banking credit, it has gone up by 50% in half a year. And where has it gone? I mean, the economy grew at 7.7%, which is fantastic everywhere, but by Chinese standards, it's actually a slowdown. So it has gone a bit in real estate markets, but the rest must just be sitting there for people probably waiting for the government to crack down on new funding, make sure that they have liquid assets to tide them over. So China has a bubbly economy now, has a credit bubble. It's gone mainly into corporates, especially, and real estate. And the banking sector and the shadow banking sector that produced it are sitting on massive losses. Right? At some point, these have to be recognized, realized, and then replaced by a government injection of capital. And we're talking about 20% of GDP or more of possible bad loans come out of the massive stimuli intermediated through the banks, initiated by local governments through special purpose vehicles. So China has to, if it is going to grow without a recession, which I define as growth not below 4% in China, they're going to have to manage the financial crunch that is looming, and they have to then change the growth model. There is a trajectory that gets you there, but it is a high road with rather nasty precipices on both sides. Our central forecast is that they will manage that road, but there's a lot that could go wrong. I thought the 7% was very good and probably not sustainable for the rest of the year, for what it's worth. The country will slow down more simply because the manifest insustainability of its existing growth model can no longer be overcome simply by pushing harder on the same button.
Mohamed, is emerging markets, is it just a China story these days? And usually we would see outperformance given how the general markets have been doing, but we've seen underperformance. What do you attribute that to?
So it's much more than a China story. The China story, it's fascinating to hear the narrative on China because it speaks to something much more. The narrative in China has gone from these are competitors that are eating our lunch every single day, and maybe if they trip, that's okay because we can regain market share, to let's hope China doesn't hard land because the consequences are pretty bad. That speaks to something much bigger that Tom Friedman of the New York Times writes about, which is we have gone from an interconnected world to an interdependent world. And it's very important for us to understand that. In an interdependent world, your competitors are your friends. Because if they fall too hard, they drag you down with you. And that's why people are scared of the hard landing in China. They're not saying, great, this is an opportunity. They're saying, I'm going to be pulled down. And in an interdependent world, your friends, Europe, also can drag you down. So that's the reality we're living in. I have more optimism on China than Willem does in terms of, yes, they have really complicated transitions. But unlike the US, they are very good at identifying where they want to be, taking the first few steps, and learning as they go along, and course correcting. What I worry about China is very different. I worry about the ability of the world to accommodate China, which is very different from China navigating its own process. If you're Chinese right now, you say, wait a minute, I am being pushed to go from an export-led growth to a domestic growth, while Japan is doing the other way around. Mm-hmm. And Japan is being enabled to do something else. Now, why is it that different principles are being applied? Why is it that my voice in multilateral governance is nowhere near what it should be? I am just above Belgium. Just think about that, just above Belgium. So I worry about that. The rest of the emerging world is interesting. There are some really interesting stories going on. Go back to Africa. It's incredible what's happening in certain parts of Africa. Brazil, yes, it's hit a cyclical slowdown, but fundamentally things are changing underneath the surface. So I think that as we go forward, we're going to realize that there's a lot more than China, and we're going to realize also that labels are misleading. Right? So we did the typical thing, and Alex, we do it all the time, which is go advanced, US, Europe, Japan, and then lump all the emerging markets together. There will come a time when we will forget about labels. We will go by economic characteristics. What are the healthy balance sheets in the world and are growing? And there's a bit of advanced economies, lots of emerging economies. What are the economies that are healing but aren't there yet? And what are the weakest economy? And we're going to forget about these labels that tend to influence us excessively and are really backward looking at this stage.
Let me just make a comment about I agree with your comments, and I very much agree with yours. And China is very, very determined. And I think they've laid out a plan. I don't know if you saw the China 2030 report that the World Bank put together in conjunction with the China Development Research Center. And it's an amazingly frank report. They're transitioning from a middle-income country to a high-income country, and they know what they need to do to get from here to there. And it's an amazing report. It's very introspective, and it says, okay, these are all the things that are wrong. These are all the things that we need to do, and they're laying out a plan in terms of reforms for government and, of course, most importantly, the financial sector. They have pretty well underdeveloped financial sector. It's kind of amazing to the size of China. Their financial sector is relatively underdeveloped, and they need to increase the products, the way things, the transparency, and all of the things that make good functioning capital markets. And so they're on the road to that. So I wouldn't underestimate their ability to achieve what they're trying to achieve.
We're almost out of time, so what I'd like to do is go, starting with Ken, go across the panel. If you have one piece of advice for policymakers, given the discussion we've just had, you can choose the United States, Europe, wherever you want to focus. What would it be?
I think it's easy. In the United States, it's time to embrace entitlement reform.
Embrace?
Entitlement reform. This is the elephant in the room. It's been running around the room for the last 4 years. We need to deal with this elephant. In Europe, it's embrace labor market reform. Neither of these are going to be popular policies to implement. Both of them are necessary policies. Putting these issues behind us will reignite growth in the Western Hemisphere in a profound way. It's time we do it for the benefit of our citizens.
Mohamed.
Reverse the way you approach things. So instead of arguing over the short term, try and agree on a vision in 5 years' time. And I think most people can agree on a vision in 5 years' time in terms of what society needs, and then work backwards. And don't try to identify every step. Just identify the first few steps and keep that North Star out there so that the population also knows what it is.
I would say a couple things for policymakers, especially the Fed. I would say stay independent. I think that the Fed has become so politicized, especially since '08, and I think we need to get away from that. I think they need to make the tough decisions, stay independent, and do what their charter tells them to do.
I would advise, of course, fiscal reform, labor reform, and also when it comes to the regulatory reform, I would say just get on with it. Come up with the rules, and let's implement them and get on with them, make them consistent and uniform across, not only within the U.S., but across the globe. Because the uncertainty is really what's holding the economies back from growing, because with this overhang of not knowing which direction we're going, many institutions don't even know, banks don't even know what the banking model is going to be in the future until we figure out what the regulation is going to be.
But I think we've switched from uncertainty as the key problem to this very depressing certainty that nothing is actually getting done. Uncertainty was a great buzzword in 2009. I think the word for 2013 and 14 is the certainty that nothing is getting done. You know, Terry and I both come from the great state of Illinois, where we have the luxury of no bipartisan politics. Democratic mayor, Democratic House, Democratic Senate, Democratic governor. And yet we cannot put into place pension reform. We have the worst pension crisis in the country. We have no reform. We could not put in place education reform. A friend of mine on the school board of the schools in Chicago says, well, it's politically difficult. To whom I said, and every single person in office is a Democrat. Why is this so hard for you? It's the intersection of our kids' interests and the interests of the unions. And we cannot affect tort reform in Illinois. And by the way, we did tax reform. We doubled our taxes to try to cover up all of our deficit spending, pushing countless businesses out of our state. The population of Chicago has fallen by 7% in 12 years. Rick Perry took out a full-page ad, "Come to Texas," in the Chicago Tribune.
So you've got the Democrats on all sides in your state, and you can't do anything. Willem, 27 nations in Europe, what hope do we have there?
Well, I think Europe knows what it has to do. It has to restructure its banks, its sovereigns. It has to complete the single market, reform the labor market, the professions. And when I say reform the labor market, it's really to deregulate it. For the US, the Fed should keep doing what it's doing until inflation threatens, according to the reaction function decide. It needs entitlement reform, tax reform, health reform, make healthcare affordable. Invest in infrastructure, which is deplorable in this country. It's third world level. Invest in education, improve the quality of education. And most important, substitute the rule of law for the rule of lawyers, which is, I think, a major obstacle to efficiency.
With that, I think we're out of time, so please join me in thanking our panel.
Good job, Alex.
Thank you.